An employee in your organization got a phishing email. They clicked a link, landed on a real Microsoft login page, typed their password and completed MFA, and walked away thinking that nothing had happened. And they were right. Nothing suspicious happened on their end, but somewhere across the internet, an attacker's device just received an authenticated session token for that account. The password is irrelevant now. The MFA prompt is already fired and passed. And a password reset tomorrow morning won't fix anything because the token stays valid regardless. That's what we're tracking right now, and it's working at scale. Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Brandon Tirado, Director of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilligan, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And to start things off, I have a question for our listeners. So your phishing defenses passed every check against the phishing email. They saw a real login page, a real MFA prompt, and no malicious attachment. So the question is, why is the attacker already inside your environment?
Yeah, and most teams hear that and assume that the attacker had to break something real, but they actually didn't.
Yeah, and the technique that we're talking about in this episode, it abuses a legitimate authentication flow, and it's called device code phishing. You're supposed to get a code, type it into a real login page, and the device gets authenticated access. But the problem is that there's nothing in the flow that checks whether the device waiting for the resulting token is yours or an attacker's. The user completes real MFA at a real login page, and that token goes to whoever sent the lure.
Which is why the inbox piece matters. If your team is already stretched on phishing reports, the ones doing session theft look identical to everything else in that queue. There's no fake domain, no malicious attachment. It's just a real logon page and a code. The volume that it masquerades in is really the cover.
Yeah, so exactly. Let's ground this in what we're actually seeing across our customer base. The scale of these campaigns and how the technique has really shifted in the last few months here. So we've been watching this hit enterprise cloud accounts since late March. And what's different now isn't that there's one particular campaign, but it's really that the playbook looks the same every time we've seen it. A wide range of victims, but the same moves by the threat actors. In our telemetry, we've seen a sustained increase in this activity since late March. And what really stands out from that is that the post-compromise playbook is consistent across incidents. It's not just get the token and start browsing. We're seeing malicious inbox rule creation, rogue device registration, and business email compromise activity all running in sequence, back to back, sometimes within seconds. They're working from a script, and this isn't someone poking around to see what they can grab. The playbook is written before the threat actors even have a token.
Yeah, John, and to put some scale on what that consistency really looks like, a single campaign this spring alone hit 13,000 organizations across 26 countries, mostly in the US, healthcare, financial services, professional services, technology, et cetera. They took the hardest hits, but you don't reach that scale by hand. And that's what's important here. Someone built a machine for this.
Yeah, and really, Brandon, to piggyback off that number of 13,000 organizations hit, that's what really matters. Nobody hits that many targets that fast without automated delivery and automated token processing on the back end. And then there's another dimension, which is phishing as a service, or these phishing kits that are spun up for threat actors to purchase. Back in March, we tracked a campaign that hit more than 340 organizations across 5 countries. And it was linked to a phishing as a service platform that launched on Telegram that same month with turnkey abilities, including email harvesting, business email compromise infrastructure, and AI-assisted automation. Now, before that kit and other kits like it, you needed real tradecraft to pull off this type of attack at this scale. Whereas after it, you really just need a Telegram account and a credit card.
Yeah, John, and security researchers tracking those earlier campaigns, also assessed that this technique has been more effective at successfully compromising accounts than most other targeted spear phishing campaigns that the same actors had run in months past. That's the comparison that I really want to flag for the CISO audience that's listening here. This isn't just another phishing vector. It's truly outperforming the other approaches.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and certainly that's why we're covering it today. Now, on another side, there's a convergence that's happening here that we're seeing in May, where another major established phishing as a service tool, and this is one that has been historically one of the most sophisticated platforms, added this capability of device code phishing to its toolkit. Again, another sign that this is significant and the threat actors are swarming around it. So when an established kit adds a technique, it means that the technique is now available to every subscriber of that service, including actors who have never built this capability themselves. The phishing as a service operators are really converging on this token theft, meaning the actors that can run this technique a year from now won't be the same ones who invented it. It's anyone who paid for the subscription. And there's a second flavor of this, something researchers are calling consent hijacking, which is the same idea, but the whole attack stays inside the victim's browser. There's no device code, no email needed. The victim gets redirected to an OAuth login, and the authorization code ends up with the attacker. This method is primarily delivered through search engine optimization poisoning rather than just email, but does show up in email lures too. Different lures, same goal, really getting at that point of targeting tokens instead of passwords.
And that's what our telemetry is showing as well, right? It's spread across hospitality, manufacturing, healthcare, higher education, et cetera. It's not one sector that's vulnerable to device code phishing. It's any sector essentially with a cloud footprint, a cloud account footprint. The breadth of that targeting alone tells you that this is a widely distributed adoption and not a narrowly scoped campaign.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the landscape we've set up. But the reason this is a harder problem than it looks, and really the reason many defenses that should catch it aren't, is what Brandon's going to get into next.
Yeah. And so, John, here's why it's hard to catch. The whole attack, it runs on legitimate authentication. It's a real login page that the user is interacting with. It's a real MFA prompt that the user is satisfied, and it's a trusted Microsoft application. Nothing that the user sees and nothing that most tools are going to be, in tune to fire on, right? The sign-in looks right. The damage is really in what happens after. So the user logs into a real portal. They don't see a fake site. There's nothing to download, no suspicious redirect that their browser flags. And what we've seen in our telemetry is this campaign class is using legitimate Microsoft authentication workflows rather than credential harvesting pages, which is exactly why it's likely to evade user suspicion and harder for defenders to distinguish from normal sign-in activity. So the signal that would catch isn't the login event itself.
Yeah, no, it's not. And to layer on there, the timing constraint that should limit this technique, which is the device codes being only valid for 15 minutes, have been engineered around on both sides of the attack. State-aligned actors in earlier campaigns coordinated in real time with their victims to make sure that code got entered before it expired. But in the latest iterations, what we're seeing in these phishing as a service platforms, they've built in an automatic refresh into their infrastructure to really remove that timing constraint entirely, as the page that they land on automatically generates new codes, so the attacker doesn't have to worry about the old codes expiring at all.
Yeah, and what's really, really, I guess, depending on what angle you're looking at it from, there's a log legitimacy problem here, and it is interesting because compromised sessions from a device code phishing campaign can inherit a compliant or a managed device attribute from the victim's original authentication. So an attacker's activity after the fact may actually appear legitimate in sign-in logs, because the sign-in may look like it's coming from a managed sign-in because it's inheriting those attributes from when the user actually went through accepting or providing that device code. And so that's the detection gap. And that matters, right? Because specifically, defenders are actively looking for anomalous sign-in patterns. And filtering on managed devices or not is often a signal that people look into. And then, on top of that, there's a consent hijacking variant to all of this, the one that stays entirely in the browser. That achieves full account compromise without obtaining user passwords or even triggering MFA alerts to begin with. The authorization code is sitting in the browser's address bar. So there's no suspicious attachment. Again, there's no credential to steal, nothing that looks like a traditional phishing campaign. However, our team here at ReliaQuest has seen that this is a significant because it's exploiting, again, an OAuth authorization flow by intercepting authorization codes before legitimate applications even ever consume them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the analysts who have been working this, including our own, really anticipate that this consent hijacking technique would likely expand to include additional OAuth authentication flows and first-party applications beyond where it originally started, specifically in the next several months. And given what we've seen with the Phishing as a service kits adding in the device code capability in May, that expansion really appears to be materializing.
So let's talk about why a password reset doesn't fix this. All right. Tokens obtained via device code phishing remain valid even after the account password is reset. Access persists unless active sessions and refresh tokens are explicitly revoked. This is not a corner case or a misconfiguration, right? It's how the OAuth token lifecycle actually works. And defenders who reset the password and close the ticket have not ended this attacker's access.
No, they certainly haven't. And another important point too is that attackers are even evolving within this campaign. And this is something we saw in our telemetry just last week, back on May 20th, where attackers are now registering 3 or more rogue devices on a compromised account within seconds, right? So these are device registrations that would be used for MFA. And so even a full token revocation may still leave reentry pass if the device registrations aren't cleaned up. That's a very recent adaptation, and it means that the remediation checklist got longer without most response workflows even knowing it.
Yeah, and the post-compromise playbook that you were talking about earlier, John, inbox rule creation, rogue device registration, bulk data staging, typical BEC activity is definitely consistent and absolutely automated in most cases. It's running too fast to not. And that gets to the two problem structure worth naming here. Plainly, the inbox problem, the volume aspect of that, and the token theft posture problem. And both are not the same, obviously, problem. And solving one doesn't solve the other. So automated phishing triage, that reduces that volume burden that is creating capacity for practitioners to actually look and identify token theft posture or look at token theft posture, but that posture work still has to happen separately. So clearing that queue, getting the analyst more in touch or in line with being able to go proactively look at what posture means to the organization is ultimately where organizations need to head.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's certainly something we talk about every episode of organizations being able to do the real work that gets them ahead of these threats. But something I want to stress too is that the reach here is really everywhere. You mentioned quite a few sectors, including healthcare, manufacturing, et cetera. But it's larger than that. It's anyone running cloud accounts, they're in scope. And as we're putting this into context here, this device code phishing, it's not just an emerging technique anymore. It's a finished product that's being delivered in these phishing kits, and the attackers are running it like one.
And that maturity is exactly what makes the post-compromise window dangerous. The playbook runs the same way every time. The rogue device registration fires in seconds, and the inbox rule runs automatically. After the break, the 3 things you can check on Monday morning coming up.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at reliaquest.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about why a password reset isn't quite enough. Tokens staying valid, rogue devices stayed registered, and attackers' automation is already ahead of a manual response. So let's get into 3 specific things that actually close these gaps. First, we want to highlight the conditional access scope problem, because this is where the structural gap lives for most organizations, and it's a leader level question. Most conditional access policies are built around one check. Did the user complete MFA? Where device code phishing here passes that check every single time. The user really did MFA on a real page. The question the policy never asks is which device walks away with that token.
Yeah, and then to layer in, there's also a first-party trust problem that makes this even harder to address. When you're dealing with the consent hijacking variant specifically, the browser native technique, the application involved is a first-party application, which really just means it's implicitly trusted by the identity provider. But what this means to organizations is that you can't block it via application allow listing without also blocking the legitimate tool that your team needs. The control that should address this isn't application blocking, it's conditional access scope.
So the 3 questions worth asking your identity team tomorrow, first, does our conditional access policy explicitly restrict device code grant flows where possible? Say in Microsoft Entra ID, the OAuth 2.0 device authorization grant flow can be disabled for users and workloads that don't require it. If your standard user accounts don't have a legitimate need for it, that's a policy decision you can make right now. And second, does the policy allow only authentications from managed devices? And third, are your most sensitive data stores and services protected? Meaning access is restricted to physical office locations or known IP ranges where the risk profile is lower.
Yeah, and an important point to really stress here is that even for advanced teams, a conditional access policy can be matured and well maintained for the traditional credential theft model, but it still potentially misses the device code grant flow entirely. And especially a CISO whose team is already stretched on phishing volume likely hasn't had the capacity to review that CA scope for the device code grants, and especially for first party application trust. So, really, the policy and the technique need to be aligned.
And that's the policy question. The next one is what your response actually does once a policy violation lands.
Yeah, and that's where we're going next. So, the second piece is what happens when you confirm a compromise, and specifically whether your response workflow is scoped to actually end the attacker's access, not just reset passwords. So the foundation here is something worth stating plainly. Tokens remain valid after a password reset unless active sessions and refresh tokens are explicitly revoked. Now, this is how OAuth was designed to work. A password reset and token revocation are 2 separate operations, where if your runbook only does the first one, the attacker still has access, not by an accident, but by design.
And the fresh signal that I want to bring up in this episode is from our own telemetry on which we saw on May 20th. Attackers are now registering 3 or more rogue devices per compromised account within seconds of getting the token. And that's new, right? And existing workflows that revoke sessions but don't also deregister those rogue devices leave the attacker with another entry point or entry path rather into the network. So even after a clean revocation of that asset is run.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, kind of take it back to what we talked about earlier. The timing dimension matters here. We discussed that post-compromise playbook, multiple events happening in sequence, such as inbox rule creation and device registration. It's running fast. So if the response workflow is waiting for a human analyst to work through your queue and manually trigger remediation steps, the attacker's automation already has completed multiple steps before the first remediation action even runs. So the attacker's response to a confirmed compromise is automated and it runs in seconds. So the response really needs to match that speed. A workflow that automatically revokes tokens and deregisters rogue devices the moment a phishing confirmation fires means that your remediation isn't waiting on a human to run each step manually while the attacker's automation is already finishing. That attacker's post-compromise sequence, again, it's scripted, it's fast, and that response needs to be too. So the recommendation here is concrete. Open your security tool or your identity management platform and verify two things. First, that your token relocation workflow fires automatically on confirmed phishing reports, not just manual analyst triggers. And then second, that your workflow's scope covers that rogue device deregistration alongside token revocation, not just session termination or password resets alone.
Yeah, and I really gotta jump in there just to reemphasize that, right? Especially with what we just released and talked about from something we observed on May 20th. You know, this is recent enough that many existing response workflows weren't built with this scope. If your revocation workflow was designed around revoking sessions plus revoking a refresh token, it's probably not addressing the rogue device restraints that an attacker can use to pivot back into the environment. And the last one we want to talk through is the volume problem, because it's the environment that these campaigns run in, and it's not separate, right, from the token theft problem. And so the inbox problem is what gives these campaigns so much runway. A team buried in phishing reports doesn't have the bandwidth to notice that some of those reports aren't credential theft, they're token theft. It's the same camouflage, it's just a different game.
Yeah, and especially that camouflage is what makes things much harder. The lures themselves that are being used in these emails are making things worse, not better. And our analysts are projecting that future device code phishing campaigns will lean heavily on more legitimate looking lures. Things like collaboration platform invites, IT support requests, and HR notifications. Those are the categories that are hardest to triage at speed with high plausibility and high volume. Really, the kind of email a busy employee acts on without even thinking, which is exactly why the threat actors pick those themes.
So the question for the volume side is, how many steps require a human to action? Like those steps between a user reporting a suspicious email and that email being removed from every inbox. An automated phishing investigation workflow that triages reported emails, scores them, removes malicious messages from every inbox on the distribution without waiting on analyst action compresses the window for those campaigns to have run in your environment. So you're not removing the human review step permanently. You're removing it from the critical path when confidence is high enough to act automatically.
Yeah, and there's a critical distinction here that's worth noting, is between the automated phishing triage addressing the volume problem. It's not going to specifically address the revoked tokens, and it's not going to audit your device registrations or update your conditional access scope. But what it really does is create the time and capacity for your practitioners to focus on those things that matter and do the posture work that the volume management alone can't do.
That's the technical picture, right? 3 gaps, 3 specific fixes. What we want to close on is the question underneath all of those. What it actually takes to operationalize a response that runs faster than the attacker's playbook, right? So let's close this out. We've covered a lot of ground, the technique, why it's structurally hard to catch, and the 3 specific places to look. 3 things I'd hand to a security leader listening to this right now, right? The first, your phishing volume and your post authentication posture, again, aren't the same investment, even though there are similarities. A team that's keeping up with the queue can still have conditional access policy that nobody is reviewing in relation to the specific grant flows that we spoke about earlier. The second thing is about what we saw in our report in May of this phishing as a service convergence and the changes that it has to the risk picture. When a major established phishing platform adds a new token theft capability and makes it available to its subscriber base, the threat actor in the mix changes. right? What was primarily a state-aligned actor problem, or a more sophisticated threat actor, the kind of things organizations manage by watching geopolitical signals, or investing in very expensive threat intelligence platforms, is now a commodity tooling problem. The volume of actors with access to this capability went up sharply in May. And that changes the likelihood calculus, not just the technique's description. The third thing here is the operating reality that these three fixes point towards. The attacker's post-compromise steps are scripted, and they're running in seconds. Rogue devices registered in seconds, inbox rules firing in that same window. If your response is still waiting on a human to click through each step, you've already lost that race before the alert is even opened. So the bigger, broader question here, the one that lives past whatever configuration changes you make this week, is whether or not your response was built for a world where the credential is the target, because it isn't anymore. That's not a next quarter conversation. It's definitely a conversation you want to be having this week. And for the leaders listening again right now, the 10-minute tomorrow morning action, ask your identity team when they last reviewed the conditional access policy scope specifically for device code authentication grant flows, not the MFA policy broadly, that specific grant flow. If they can't answer that question in under a minute, you know that the review never happened. If it takes more than that to find out, you have the answer that you already needed.
All right. So those are some great recommendations for the leaders. I'm going to bring it home for the operator side of things. And where I'd really land this is the mental model shift that we're really asking for, where a confirmed phishing report no longer means just reset a password and close the ticket. The response is session containment now, including tokens, devices, and active grants all in scope. That's a different starting point than where most response efforts begin today. And the reason that shift matters isn't just the analysts weren't fast enough before. It's the attacker's device registration, those inbox rules executing in seconds and in parallel. That manually triggered response workflow is just structurally slower by design than an automated one. Not a criticism of a team, but really just the reality of how the two timelines are comparing. So when a confirmed phishing email arrives, the question that analysts now need to ask to start isn't, did the user's password get exposed, but rather, does the attacker have an active session? Are there rogue devices registered on that account? And is the revocation workflow already running? So tomorrow morning, for those practitioners, pull the last 30 days of sign-in logs filtered on device code authentication events. That data tells you whether this grant flow is active in your environment and at what volume. It's a starting baseline. And by the end of the day, you'll have the three things on your screen that you didn't have this morning: an understanding of the volume, the accounts that use the authentication, and really a starting point to begin to look for these unexpected authentications we've been laying out.
To close this out, with everything that we discussed in today's episode, the real question here is whether your response was built for the world that we're actually in today, where the credential isn't the target anymore. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away, and you can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.